very happy to be live with Helen Erichsen.
Hello, everyone.
It's going to start us off with an introduction to herself and her debut book.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Helen Erichsen, and this is my debut novel, which is called Murder by Natural Causes. And the clue is in the name, because there are lots and lots of murders in the book, but none of them are investigated as murders because they all look as though they are deaths by natural causes, such as, a heart attack or suicide. Well, that's not natural, but it's not a murder. And the main protagonist in my book, that is her speciality. Her speciality is what's known as the dry job, which is a derivative of the wet job, which I think is a KGB term involving the spilling of blood. But the deaths that she is responsible for generally involve no blood, so that they are regarded as by natural causes, and that means there's never a murder investigation, and consequently she is in great demand for her skills.
Good description.
Thank you.
You get some descriptions of bridge as well, which is something you're
absolutely. I wouldn't say I'm an expert player. I'd say I'm a very good amateur. I'm married to an expert player, and bridge has played an enormous role in my life and is something that I truly, truly love. So I really wanted to try and get bridge into a novel in a way that would be acceptable to the reader. You can't talk about bridge in technical terms because you'd write about 3 sentences and then people would fall asleep. So instead, what I did was to try and get across the feeling of winning and losing. And because bridge sometimes involves betting for money, I think everybody understands winning and losing money and the feelings that gives to people. And so that was something I tried to get into the book. Obviously, if a few people decide to take up bridge as a result of reading this, I will die happy.
You're more than just a talented amateur, though. You told me that you did really well in the European.
Okay, maybe I've got better. I can remember there was the very first time I ever played for England, I sort of thought to myself, can't really talk about myself as a novice anymore, can I? But I think it's just, I don't know. I think when you play bridge, you realise that it's such a conundrum of a game, and however much you play, you can always be better and do better and make less mistakes. That I actually find it quite hard to say, yeah, it's something I'm good at, if that makes sense. But I love it to the nth degree. Playing bridge is really more fun than anything I can think of.
Do you think there's a risk when you talk about, so we're thinking like things like the Queen's Gambit did the same with chess, didn't it? Do you think there's a risk of turning readers off when you delve into like quite a technical?
Yes. I'm sure there is a risk, and I think it is definitely a risk worth taking. I think that writers that don't take risks are almost by definition liable to be boring. I want to portray a passion of mine, and what I really wanted to do was to write an absolute page turner. I personally think that writing should entertain, and I hate it when I myself am bored by a book. So I really, if I have bored anybody by involving bridge in my writing, that is my fault and nobody else's, and I take full responsibility for that.
Where did the idea
go on? Sorry.
Where did the idea come from for Stella, your main character?
That is a very good question. It came from quite a variety of sources. One, I wanted to write a sort of female heroine that broke the mold. I myself get annoyed by portrayals of women that are just sort of unrealistic. So, for instance, if a woman's going to fight a man, she's not going to fight on a man's terms. She's not going to punch him and kung fu kick him, because the likelihood is he would overwhelm her with his strength. A woman is going to be much more tactical and evasive, and the punches are going to miss because she'll move out of the way. And so I think that was something I very much wanted to do. I also wanted to write a portrayal of a psychopath without ever using that word. So I wanted to kind of leave it up to the reader to decide who it was that they were dealing with on the page, and yet still at some level make them root for her. And again, you know, some people absolutely love the main protagonist, Scylla. Some really don't like her, and I respect both opinions. Like, there was one review that said, I detested Scylla from the get-go, and I thought to myself, good for you, good for you. She is quite detestable. And yet some people really love her as well, and I find that's very endearing. I mean, to some extent, I'm sure she's a projection of me, my younger self, and for that I apologise.
I'm going to go back to some more questions in a minute, but you got some hellos from Samantha and Laura. Laura said she loved the book when she read it on Pigeonhole.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, Samantha. Thank you, Laura. I mean, you know, it's just, it warms the cockles of a writer's heart to know that somebody enjoyed their book. In the end, that's all that really matters.
She also went on, Laura, to say it's definitely a page turner, and the bridge sections weren't boring. She learnt a bit.
Well, that's wonderful, because as I said, I have a deep and abiding passion for bridge. You could literally divide my life into before bridge and after bridge, because I didn't actually learn to play till I was 30. So in bridge terms, I was quite a late developer. And so I remember not playing bridge, and my life was emptier when I didn't play bridge. It's richer and more fulfilling once the game came into my life. So I'm very glad that the bridge sections were not boring. That was very much my intention. I just, like I said, I did not want to make anybody stop reading because they thought, oh, Jesus, bridge, I'm not reading about that.
I mean, the thing I'm liking at the moment, and I'm not at the end because I've had a very busy week, I'm sorry.
Not a problem.
Over the book. I was trying my hardest. But what I like about it is it's quite thrillery and quite action-packed in places. But like you said with Scylla, she's not unbelievable. You know, she's described as this, like, she's quite small, you know, she's quite slight, and so she uses what she has,
Exactly.
like her brain and her like slightness and things, to her advantage, and she interprets that and approaches things in an interesting way that I think is really realistic.
If you think about it, why would spies be anything but invisible? If you were going to train someone as a spy, you wouldn't take the most visible person in the room. You would take the person that slips into the crowd. And yet that often doesn't seem to be the way characters were written. So I wanted to try and do that. And the other thing is that someone who is trained as an assassin, they don't exist in a vacuum. They are as a result of everything that's ever happened to them and their temperament as well. And so I really wanted to get that across about how someone is formed to be their present self, as it were, and what they're going to try and take with them into the future as well. Because there's very much a point in the book quite early on where she realizes that this is not a job with a future. It's a dead-end job, pardon the pun. And therefore she wants to try and invent a future for herself.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know where that goes because, like I said, I'm not at the end. But I quite like the fact that it goes sort of backwards and forwards, doesn't it? So you get
it does.
Now realize that there's a dead end job, like you said, where she's got to think of a future for herself, and then almost thinking for a future for herself takes her back to thinking about how she's ended up where she is.
I found that doing this dual timeline worked really well. And to be honest, when I was writing it, I didn't write the whole of one timeline and then the whole of the other. I literally wrote them in alternate chapters from the beginning to the end. One of the things that really helped me when I was writing is that a friend of mine, I was writing during the second lockdown. So obviously, you know, I was just at home, not seeing anybody apart from my family. And a friend of mine emailed me and he said, what are you doing at the moment? And I said, I'm trying to write a novel. And he said, send me a chapter. So I did. And he said, oh, I like it. Send me another one. So I did. And before I knew it, I was literally writing chapters for him. And that was incredibly helpful because it kind of kept me going. It was like I was doing a serialization just for one individual reader. But I also think it was quite interesting because he's a man. And so I think at some level that affected the way I wrote, that my audience was a single male audience. And I think in some subtle way that really helped my book, because I kind of felt that I could do this perspective. I'm writing as a woman about a woman, but it has that thrillery, fast-paced feel. And what I hope is that then it spans readership, as it were, for maybe people who like a fast-paced book, people who also like quite an in-depth character analysis. I'm kind of hoping that I slipped both in somehow. I was very ambitious with the book as well, but possibly too much so. But who dares wins and all that.
I think there's quite a character analysis. Like you said, I'm generally not a fan of fast-paced books, but I am really enjoying this one.
Well, that's very pleased to hear that. But I'm not precious about it. I really love reading my reviews. I know a lot of authors told not to read their reviews, but I love reading them, even the bad ones. I think it's important. I think people are allowed to have their opinions and their perspectives, and they're all valid. Do you know what I mean? I put it out there in the world. And also as a bridge player, you see, you get really used to ritual humiliation in bridge because it's part of the game. So I think it gives you a reasonably thick skin. And I think as an author, you need that as well, because you get knocked back a bit on the journey to publication and beyond, shall we say.
Yeah. Laura has said she wouldn't have thought she'd be rooting for a psychopath, but she was for Scylla.
Well, that's nice, isn't it? You see, that's the thing, is psychopaths do get a very bad press, don't they, really? And whilst they obviously have a very different emotional makeup to other people, they do have an emotional makeup. I think psychopaths are normally put across in literature and in films as being evil. Do you know what I mean? And so I wanted to give a more rounded picture of somebody who struggled even to acknowledge their own feelings, let alone sort of explain them. And also there's something in Scylla, there's something about her as an adolescent and growing up that I think we all relate to. We've all gone through those difficult teenage years. It's just hers involved mass murder, that's all.
So there's like some interesting side characters in the book as well, isn't there? There's people who pop up and they're only in there for a bit, or
well, some of the victims, I'm afraid, don't last very long.
The victims don't last very long. There are people that Scylla's almost, I want to say friends with. I don't know if friends is the right word, but has a relationship with that are like.
Well, it's all, in a sense, part of the book is about her building relationships with people, which I think is something that she finds very hard. So yes, they do sort of pop up and give her a helping hand along the way. I think, she has one friend at school who is helpful to her and probably helps her have more feelings, even though she doesn't find them very pleasant at the time.
Yeah. Laura wants to know, and I'm intrigued by this as well, will there be a sequel?
The $1 million question, will there be a sequel? I think there are probably several things going on. The first I guess is if this book is successful, I will definitely carry on writing. And I have done some writing since, a slightly different sort of a book with completely different characters. And I'm happy to come back to Scylla. I'd quite like to maybe do a sequel and a prequel. And I think if I did a prequel, what I'd quite like to write about Vladimir Hoga, the sort of sinister gangster boss, and how he came to be who he is. And in doing that, I'd quite like to incorporate bridge in the 60s and 70s, because it was a lot more glamorous then. And people would dress up in black tie to go to bridge tournaments, and you had some quite famous people playing bridge, and I'd love to incorporate that in, and I'd obviously incorporate lots of murder into that as well. If I write a sequel about Scylla and I want to be and I make that commitment to her, she probably can't kill people anymore. I mean, maybe she could just maim them a bit or something, because she has made a sort of abiding promise that she's giving that up. So how I would incorporate that into the future and still make her quite a thrilling character, I'd have to look at quite carefully. But I am very fond of her, and Yes, I think there's quite possibly a sequel in there, I think.
I'm intrigued about the club where people play bridge. You
That's a
mentioned,
real place.
yeah, I was going to ask you that. That was going to be one of my questions. But before I get there about it being a real place, you mentioned sort of famous players who are playing at matches there. I wanted to know if they were real
Yeah,
famous.
quite a lot of them are real. There's the most famous bridge player probably in the world is a chap called Zia Mahmood, and he is like the equivalent of bridge royalty, I think it would be fair to say. And you know, he is a marvelous ambassador for bridge, and so I had to put him in there. So he has like a cameo role, and obviously I had to write to him and say, would it be okay if I, and I don't think I even sent him the pages, because he basically, I mean, he's a friend of mine and my husband, and he was immediately like, yes, of course you can. And you know, the other bridge players who I mentioned in there that I asked their permission, they were all very generous in just saying yes, of course. So that was really nice. There's a player called Nick Sanquist. He gets a little mention in there, and another one called Robert Sheehan. He gets a mention. And then there's a couple of bridge players who are no longer with us, who are wonderful bridge players of their era. And, you know, again, I just wanted to stick them in there, because those high stakes rubber bridge players who play for a lot of money, I mean, they're like gods of the game, really. And everybody else reveres them.
And then the club you said is real.
Yeah, yeah. When I first met my husband, he was working there, so that's how I got to know it quite well. And then for a while, I taught bridge there as well. So again, I knew it reasonably well, and knew the characters, and knew the way the game worked, and the clientele. So I think there's a lot in there that just has this kind of authentic feel, because it is authentic, you know.
But hopefully there's no one like the owner.
Well, no. The owner is not based on really anybody I know. I mean, obviously, there's some composite elements of people I know. Like I borrowed a very good friend of mine, a good friend of mine's voice. And that's how I could hear him in my head, and the sort of comments he would make, and the way he would swear, and his sort of booming voice. That does belong to a bridge playing friend of mine. But no, he's not actually based on anybody real. I don't know anybody that bad. I don't know any gangsters actually either.
You're quite inventive with the sort of dry methods that Scylla uses, and the poisons and things that you talk about. What was the research like for those? Are you
Well,
naturally interested in poisons, or?
I mean, I always wanted Scylla to primarily be a poisoner, because if you look sort of historically, poison is often regarded as a woman's weapon because of its level of subterfuge, because it doesn't involve strength. And so I thought it would be really fun to bring that up to something that's more present day. And then the other thing is, I find it quite fascinating that there are lots of poisons around us in quite sort of, you know, innocuous items, as it were. So foxgloves, for instance, are very poisonous, as are apple pips. If you've got enough of them, you know, they're full of cyanide. So yes, I mean, I looked at. I probably have to have a vote of thanks to Wikipedia, because that was often the starting point of a lot of research, was just looking stuff up and what is sufficiently poisonous. I mean, I do wonder whether some poisons expert is going to come forward and say that I've got a few things wrong, and then I shall claim poetic license as an author. But I did look up a lot of things, and I'm an obsessive gardener. You know, I'm an obsessive person generally, so I tend to take things to quite an extensive degree. So the gardening came in useful to then look at poisons in plants.
There's a writer in our group, Brian Price, who advises people about science, and he's quite good on things like poisons. And
Excellent.
he definitely has opinions about chloroform being used.
Well, I only used chloroform once, and I did wonder, oh gosh, I hope it would take effect as quickly as I've said it would. He might have an opinion on that, but I mean, it's there and out in the world, so anyone is welcome to hold me to account.
I don't think it matters. I think there's an amount of artistic license that you can have with a book, isn't there? You know, like you don't. I think as long as you get the big things right, and I do get really annoyed if people get science wrong in books. As long as you get the big things right, like if you fudge something else, it wouldn't matter.
Fair enough. That's very kind of you to say so. Thank you.
You know, as long as you got the main things that most people would know are right, I think that's important.
I mean, my background's in sociology and psychology, so I think that the psychology of Scylla as a character was something that really intrigued me, and something I just wanted to delve more and more and more into as the book went on. And that's something I hope I succeeded in.
You definitely succeeded in that. I think that you kind of, I think the reason why people probably, like you said, there's that kind of reaction to Scylla that some people really don't like her and some people really do, is because you do kind of have an empathy for her because you read about her background.
One of the things I really love about her is this idea that at some level she feels her own lack of moral compass. And so she appears to attempt to put philosophy in there. Like there's a gap in her, and she's always quoting little philosophical tags. And I think it's her own attempt to create some sort of moral backdrop to her life that has no morality in it, where she's simply expected to do as she's told.
And there's a nice story about how she got her name as well, isn't there? So she
I like that as well. I like the idea that to some extent she chose her own name, and that it was because she'd been watching a lot of English television and she liked, you know, anything from Liverpool, and she had a particular affection for Cilla Black, and that just it's a small detail, but I think it does humanize her quite a lot.
It does, that like love of, yeah, I think it's all those little details that make her human, and I think is what makes it an entertaining read, because you do get like a very, very human characters all the way through.
I think one thing I found really interesting is the way different readers almost read it as a different genre. So some people read it as a straight thriller. That's fine. Some people read it as a kind of character study. That's fine. A couple of people appear to have read it as a comedy. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's fine as well. You know, I really like that aspect of it. I almost like the fact that it's not in my control anymore. I've kind of let her loose on the world, and then, you know, the world reacts to her as they choose to do so. I think that's kind of quite important, actually.
Are you writing a book 2 at the moment?
Not on this. I'm about halfway through a second book, which is about something quite different. A similar genre. It has a kind of, it's slightly more of a cozy crime thriller, although I think because I have a dark soul, it's not really cozy at all. But you know, I'm kind of loath to say too much until I've shown it to somebody who says, yeah, keep going with this. So about halfway through. I'll probably finish it, if only for my own satisfaction. But I think I will come back to Scylla because I think she's such a fascinating character, and it'd be quite interesting to see her growing up properly, you know, into her 20s and 30s, and what she does next and what she makes of her life. And once, if she manages to take control of her life and what that looks like for her.
I think what you were saying about going back and looking at sort of the other times when Bridge was like more fancy and.
Oh, I'd love to do that. I mean, the old Bridge stories are the best of all. You get stories of women shooting their husbands over the bridge table because they didn't like something he did, but all the stories of the black tie events. I mean, I don't know if you remember the actor Omar Sharif. He was a very famous actor. You know, he was in Dr. Zhivago, things like that. You know, he was a huge Bridge fan, and you know, he added massive amounts of glamour to the game, and that's what I'd like to do. I'd like to go back and look at the game when it was glamorous, because then it would be fun to write about. And tempers get incredibly heated at the bridge table as well. Even now, it's a game where emotion runs high.
And I guess maybe where it's played for money as well, like you said.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I gave a story in there at the beginning about how somebody lost a couple of £100,000 at backgammon. That's not, I've not exaggerated that at all. That used to happen. I don't think it happens so much anymore, because that high stakes gambling, there isn't as much of it now. But there definitely used to be a side game at TGRs where people would lose vast sums of money playing backgammon. So it's not out of the bounds of reality, that at all. Although I don't think anyone ever killed anybody else over it.
So before we went live, you were telling me that you're very much like me. I think you never don't have a book on the go.
Yes, I always have a book on the go. I grew up in the 70s, which was not, to be a child in the 70s was at times very dull. But I was the youngest of 3 children, and so there were always lots of books in the house. So I was always reading books that were completely inappropriate for me as well. But I just sort of grabbed them off one bookcase or another. And, it was like the most interesting part of my life was reading. So I've always read a great deal. And that's something I still do a lot of. I love to read, always have done.
Are you a multiple book at a time kind of person, or do you just...
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you read multiple books at a time, or just...
No, I do not. I cannot juggle more than one ball. I'm very good at focusing on one single thing and absolutely rubbish at multitasking. So the idea of reading 2 or 3 books at the time would be a bit like putting pudding and your main course on the same plate. It'd be like, what? That's disgusting. How can you do that? So no, other people do what's right for them, but for me, one book at a time.
Okay. I'm a multiple.
Are you? Do you? Oh my goodness! I'd worry that one would just sort of bleed into the next, especially if they were very different books.
The trick is to do different books.
Ah, okay. I shall remember that.
If you pick very different things, then they work. You can do multiple things at a time.
Okay, good to know. But I suspect I'll stick to the one book at a time. But I normally have like 2 or 3 in the background waiting, as it were. So when this one's finished, I've got the next one to move on to. One thing I did notice when my kids were small, I've got 2 daughters, and I had you're very tired, you have very little attention span. I couldn't read new books. I just went back and reread old ones because I just didn't have the sort of mental capacity to take on anything new. And then there was just a day, when they were a little bit bigger, and I thought, oh, I should start reading again, a new book, a book I have not read before. But equally, I do have favourite authors that I go back to time and time and time again. They're like old friends on my bookshelf.
Yeah, I think that's a thing of all book lovers, isn't it? So what have you read recently that you've enjoyed? You said you came prepared to the chat with books.
Always. I've just finished reading Wolf Hall, actually. I hadn't read a huge amount of Hilary Mantel. I picked up a book of short stories of hers, and I was so blown away by it. I just thought, okay, now I have to read lots of other things that she'd written. And I came across Wolf Hall and Bringing Up the Bodies. So I started Wolf Hall, and I've just finished that. And I must say, I thought it was astonishing. I mean, there is somebody who is just a master of their craft, and all I can do is doff my hat and say you're amazing, because it just felt like she inhabited Cromwell. She inhabited Thomas Cromwell and the era of its time in such a sort of incredible way. She just brought everything to life of that from that era, and especially an era that's actually been done to death, you could argue, and yet she came along, took this character, and gave us a completely different analysis of him. I thought it was wonderful. And now I am reading Pat Barker's Life Class. I really love Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy. Don't know if you've ever come across those before. They're all about the First World War. And I would say that her Regeneration trilogy is my favorite trilogy of all time. They're fantastic books anyway. So I'm reading another book of hers called Life Class. I've just started it, and it's very promising.
Do you, because you've obviously written a thriller and things, do you read crime thrillers a lot, or do you?
Not that much. I have to be honest, I actually don't. I didn't intend to write a crime thriller. That's going to sound really bizarre, but I couldn't. I wrote a book that I wanted to read. I wanted to read about a female protagonist who broke the rules of female protagonists, and I wanted to write about a psychopath. I had these ideas in my head for this book long before it was written. I don't sleep very well at night, and so often at night I would write little storylines in my head about this girl and how she had become who she was. And I wanted her to be an assassin because, as far as I knew, there weren't any female assassins. And then one day I realized that Killing Eve existed. And at that point I thought, oh, okay, I thought no one had done this, and someone has done this, and they've done this very well. And at that point I nearly thought, maybe I shouldn't write this book. Maybe there's nothing to be said. But then I just thought to myself, if only one female assassin is allowed to exist in the world, I mean, that just doesn't seem right. There are lots of male spies. Surely there should be allowed to be another, a different sort of a character, but doing the same thing. And so I hope I haven't, I know comparisons get made with Killing Eve, and I'm very complimented by that. But I hope there's enough difference as well, shall we say?
I have not read Killing Eve, so I can't tell you.
No, neither have I. Neither have I. I think I've seen a few episodes of the first series on television. That's all.
I haven't
But
seen
no,
it.
I've never read it. Another person said that they felt that the heroine had quite a lot to do with Lisbeth from the girl with the dragon tattoo, and I think I would agree with that, because she's a very, very individual character, Lisbeth, and again she breaks quite a lot of rules about female characters. I think there are too many female characters. I guess this is frequently on television, who are these sort of beautiful model-like creatures that nobody can really live up to. And I wanted to write somebody who I just felt was more kind of believable in a way. The other thing I was really interested in, and this was something very formative in the book, was that years ago I read an article about a civil war, and they were saying that both sides were co-opting children from the other side. So they would kidnap children and co-opt them for their side. Or even worse than kidnapping them, they would take the whole family hostage, and in order to get the children to sort of swear allegiance, they would get them to kill their family. I mean, it's a really outrageous and disgusting thing. And I sometimes thought about what happens to those children later on, because some of those children would have survived that civil war and would then come to adulthood with the knowledge of what they'd done. And how did they take that forward in their lives? And so that's something. And then I just was sort of thinking about how if a state were going to create child soldiers, how would they do this? How would they get them to display loyalty? And so that to some extent comes up in this novel as well.
Yeah. Did you search for the setting? I'm trying to think how to ask these questions without giving much away. Did you search for like the area that Scylla was from and the setting to match what you wanted to do with the story, or did you?
Well,
come fully?
No, I would say I kept. If you look at where Scylla's from, it's very sort of shrouded, shall we say. So I never ever give a location of where she actually was brought up. I've kept that purposefully very, very sort of vague. There is a suggestion that the school that she attended was located in a place called Kaliningrad, which is a sort of, it's like a part of Russia that's not actually in Russia, But not only that, it was a very heavily fortified military zone that civilians were not allowed into until the 90s. And so I thought it would like be the perfect location, even though there was very, very little is known about it from that era. But again, it's only a hint and a suggestion. I was quite careful to not really specify where Scylla was from in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was such a gargantuan place. She could be from several different locations.
She could, but you kind of, yeah, I was thinking
But
a
rural community is where she is from.
That kind of sort of almost Cold War-esque era, isn't it? Of like, you know, the Berlin Wall and
exactly
all that kind of thing.
The Berlin Wall is it's a fascinating thing. The Berlin Wall, its construction, the role it played in people's lives, and then of course the way it was destructed as well. I don't know if you've ever seen a film called The Lives of Others. But it was about East Germany during the Cold War, and I mean, if you haven't seen it, see it. It's a truly wonderful film. But sometimes I thought of that when I was writing this book, even though none of it is set. Well, it's not really set in East Berlin. There's one scene in West Berlin, but obviously, in order to get to West Berlin, you've got to go through East Berlin during the Cold War.
So, if a TV adaptation was made of the book, would you make a cameo? Who would you play?
Who would play? Well, do you know an actress called Bella Ramsey?
Mm-hmm.
So she's been in a very recent series called The Last of Us, which I loved. And she also had it was not a large part, but it was a very significant part in Game of Thrones, where she plays this sort of child queen who's very Tudor-esque and very impressive. So I think I'd pick Bella Ramsey to star as Scylla. If she's happy to shave her head.
Would you want?
Which I'm sure she would be as well. Sorry, what was that?
Would you want to cameo in it?
Oh gosh, yeah. If somebody offered me a cameo, I'd love it. Yeah, it'd be great fun. I think the biggest problem I'd have would be handing over the series to somebody, because if something like that were adapted for television, they'd want to bring in screenwriters, and then screenwriters would change things, and then I'd be like, no, don't do that. So I think it would be I'd have an issue with giving up control a little bit.
We've had Laura's got some opinions about. She says she hopes to enjoy Wolf Hall, the book, as the TV series was ruined for her due to Mark Rylance previously playing Flop in Bing. It's the CBeebies program, apparently.
Okay, well, I'll have to look that up, because I'm not familiar with that. My kids are grown now, so I don't watch a lot of CBeebies, but I shall look that up.
I know some CBeebies things because I work with kids, not like older kids, but they still like some cartoons and stuff. But I've not heard of Bing. Sarah and Duck, though, that's a great one.
Okay, yes. You see, my CBBC days are over, at least for a few years, until maybe I've got grandchildren, then they'll all start again, I suspect.
I don't think you need to have a kid to watch that one. That's it.
Oh, okay.
It's just a grand show.
Excellent.
Laura says she thinks the ambiguity about where exactly Scylla is from is good. It also leaves it open to develop further.
Yes, I think as a newbie author, I was quite worried about being criticised. And therefore leaving it ambiguous seemed to be like a good way to kind of dodge that bullet, as it were. But and in a sense, Scylla says right at the beginning of the book that she doesn't want to think about that, and so she refuses to think about what her name was before, and she refuses to think about where she was from. And again, the thing about her original name sort of gets revealed at the end of the book, and that was something that I really wanted to do. It's like a secret she keeps from the reader almost. So there's like one or two hints and clues about what her original name was, but you don't find out till the very end of the book. because she decides to go back to that name, because in a sense Scylla is she's trying to cast off that skin, as it were. You know, there's it's definitely not a coincidence that if you put a hard C on Scylla, you get killer.
Sam says her CBBC days are over, but she remembers the morning she spent watching Peppa Pig on CBBC long after her
Oh, I
kids.
think we all remember that.
But
Peppa
she
Pig.
said long after they'd gone to school.
I love that. That's excellent. When my younger daughter was tiny, the only thing she would watch on TV was Scooby-Doo the movie. I don't know if you have ever watched that. And so she watched it so many times that my husband and I used to have a competition with each other when the kids weren't there, that one of us would quote a line and the other one would have to say exactly where in the film it was from, because we'd both seen it about 25 times by this time.
That's great though, isn't it? Kids have an amazing ability to love stuff. That's why you end up
I know, absolutely.
How you've said you've read your reviews and things. What's the reception been like to the book coming out?
It's been really positive. It's been wonderful. I you know, as a writer who's not written anything before, I find it really quite strange that the ideas that were in my head now exist in concrete format for other people to access. And like I said, some of the advice out there is writers don't read your reviews. But I kind of think that if you don't read your reviews, how do you learn? Because one other writer said to me what I regard as a really useful thing. She said, the 5-star reviews are wonderful, but those people really love your book. So you've got nothing, there's nothing to sort of say about that. The 1-star reviews are depressing, but equally, if people hate your book that much, then you're never going to agree. But she said the 2 and 3-star reviews are where the learning is concerned, because there'll be elements that they liked about it and elements that they didn't like. And those are the reviews that you can learn from. But I think that's true about all the reviews. I find it absolutely fascinating to see what people took away from this book. And like I said, I was very, very ambitious about what I was trying to achieve, because I wanted to achieve a book that could just be read as a page turner. And it existed perfectly well as that. My husband, bless him, who's a very, very clever man, but he read it as a straightforward thriller. And that's what he took from it. But then you get other people who I wanted it to be able to be read at a deeper level as well, about the development of a personality that's very problematic.
Yeah, because she kind of has the seeds of that personality, doesn't she, when she's
very much so. And but
it's definitely fostered, and
it's exactly it. The idea was that the Soviet state were looking for suitable children, and they had these tests that would identify them. And whilst that might seem very sort of far-fetched, you only have to look at some of the things that are going on today. I mean, we see on the news about the kidnapping of Ukrainian children taken to sort of summer camps but not brought back. To know that things like that really can go on. So, but I'm not saying that did go on in the slightest. I made it all up. But I think it's not beyond the bounds of reality that things like that might take place. And also, people who are trained as spies often get picked up quite early. They're sort of picked out and sort of nurtured, presumably because they have very specific qualities that make them very suitable for those roles. And one of them would be a sort of lack of empathy, a sort of ability to never be phased as well, and to not emotionally react to things.
So one of my favourite series is a young adult series called Cherub.
Oh.
And they are written by Robert Muchamore, and he takes the idea that young children, teenagers, etc., are recruited by this agency, and they are trained to be spies. because they have, they've seen them and they've got specific skills or intelligence or things that they think would be useful, and they take them away, essentially put them in a boarding school and train them to be spies and then send them out on missions. Because
Well,
they're like, who's going to suspect a child or a family at somewhere? You think about spies going to look at stuff and you think about a man or a woman on their own. You don't necessarily think of the family with their kids.
no, absolutely, for sure. But I find that very interesting that there's some parallels there between the way I was suggesting it. I mean, because I thought about the book so much and for so long before I put pen to paper, one of the things I had in my head was that the state would only take children from large families so they wouldn't be too missed. Like if it was someone's only child, they might kick up a fuss. But if you had 4 or 5, they'd probably let one go. And although I never went with that idea particularly, it's still sort of half there. Scylla comes from quite a large family, a sort of large, rural family. And her parents don't do anything when she goes, as it were.
I wonder if also you get the feeling that, I guess it's the way the state is written and the way that from history and the way from looking at things like North Korea, that you probably wouldn't argue with the state.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, arguing would be extremely dangerous. You do as you are told in those situations, and I think that comes across as well. That in totalitarian states, the idea of any sort of individual choice doesn't exist. You'll just land yourself in prison. And again, some of the other ideas, I mean, you might not have got to this point, but I mentioned something called the Serbsky Institute, which was like a psychiatric institute in Moscow. That was a real place. And I also mentioned something called sluggish schizophrenia. And that was a real diagnosis that was handed out to political dissidents. Because if you call somebody mad, you can legitimately lock them up and you don't have to have a trial or anything. So I did a fair amount of research into Soviet propaganda, and it is beyond fascinating.
Yeah, I can imagine. I've got to the sluggish I've got past that bit. I'm quite far in.
Oh, good. So yes, so this idea of this chap from the Serbsky Institute coming and talking about sluggish schizophrenia. I mean, I took all of those from some sort of various, just various tracks and things I found describing what it meant to have sluggish schizophrenia. So that was a real thing. It was a real diagnosis at the time that was handed out liberally to people who were troublesome.
Which we know, again, there is a history of things like that. Oh, not just in Russian propaganda. If we think back to sort of the reasons you could end up in a mental asylum.
Absolutely. In Bedlam, as it would have been known. Yeah. And you go back a couple of, not that long, and you might find women having children out of wedlock looked up for similar reasons. So it has existed in history.
It has. I think that's what makes the book all the more chilling and believable, isn't it? Because these things have existed in history.
Yes, I just put them all together in one place.
Yeah.
So at least one of the assassinations is based on a real assassination as well.
Is it?
Yeah. There have been numerous assassinations that have occurred that have never quite been investigated as well. I mean, even as recently as this century, but there's a very famous assassination. Again, some of this it's not hearsay, like they think they know what happened, but nobody is absolutely sure. But there was a very famous journalist called Georgy Markov, and in the 70s he was assassinated by, just trying to remember, was it the Bulgarian secret police, I think. And it was incredibly famous because he was approached by a man as he was waiting for a bus in London. I think it was on the Strand. And the man sort of jabbed him with something. And then when he turned round, the man opened an umbrella in his face so that he couldn't see that person. And then a few days later, Georgy Markov literally became very ill and died. And the theory is that it was a pellet of ricin, which at the time there was no antidote for was inserted beneath his skin, and so I used that. I hope he would approve, but I used that in my book to show that these things really did exist.
Yeah, well, ricin is quite a...
It's a very nasty toxin, ricin.
It's a very
And I
nasty
think
toxin,
well, it
but it's
clears
not
out of the human system quite quickly. So if you don't know somebody has had ricin, you then a week or two later, you won't find it in an autopsy, I believe. You might do now, maybe, but you wouldn't have done 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, well, technology is always improving, isn't it? So you get
Exactly.
better at detecting things that you maybe wouldn't have picked up at one point. But yeah, that's no, it's interesting, and like you said, it's another one where it's easy to get hold of.
Well, exactly. I mean, poisons are unbelievably easy to get hold of and often very difficult to diagnose as well, that what has actually happened to somebody. One of the things I really liked doing with Scylla is the way she plans her murders. And she has this idea of the story, which is that if you know somebody well enough, you know you can predict how they're going to die because you know their foibles, you know their vices. And therefore, what she tries to do is to match the death to the person, because then that makes it even less invested, makes it even less likely that the death will be investigated because the person has died in a very predictable manner according to that individual. So if you're an alcoholic, she'll give you alcohol poisoning to kill you, for instance.
But I think there's where you get sort of some of those elements of comedy.
Yes, I think you do. I just think I think comedy should more or less run through everything because, well, I mean, I just enjoy it. And the other thing I really liked doing in that book was trying to juxtapose things that were slightly epic with things that were quite banal. And when you do that, it often ends up having a kind of comic element. Right at the beginning of the book, it says that Vlad employs Scylla to do 5 jobs per year plus some babysitting. And given that she's only 22 at the time, and I haven't explained what the babysitting means, that always makes me laugh because it's like, sorry, well, she's an assassin, but a babysitter on the side. How can you put these two things together? But of course, she's not babysitting children. She's babysitting a sort of young forger who's got his own story to tell.
He's one of my favourites.
Oh, I'm glad you like him. I think he's based on every public school boy I ever knew when I was young. I put them all together as a composite character and came up with him. When I was doing I had a lovely young actress did the audio book, and I offered to do some sort of like mood boards and things for her. So I had all these pictures, just taken off the internet of various things of what I thought Scylla would look like. And then I had pictures of what I thought Smithy would look like. Smithy is gorgeous in a very kind of, slightly heroin-addled sort of way. But I even sent her, I sort of sent her some YouTube video saying, this is what I think Smithy would sound like. Because what I didn't want her to do was to go for that sort of public school tone that sounds too much like you're braying, that sort of braying public school boy. No, Smithy's not going to be anything like that. Smithy will have a sort of languorous drawl to him. That's how he'll speak. But I haven't actually listened to the audio yet. I keep meaning to and then putting it off. I think I'm nervous of hearing what it's going to sound like, but that's not the voice that I have in my head. But by all accounts, she did a fantastically wonderful job. So I am looking forward to it. But I'm particularly looking forward to seeing how she made Smithy speak.
Interesting. You'll have to let us know.
I will have to let you know, won't I? Actually, but I mean, in the end, it's not for me to judge. It's for readers to judge. And one thing that has been absolutely universal is people saying that the narrator's fantastic. So, in a sense, whatever I think of her, she must be wonderful.
Yeah, well, you sound like you liked what she was doing. So you've done this chat with us. What other events have you got planned or?
Well, so the various things have happened. I did a sort of it's a bridge podcast called Sorry Partner, which anyone who plays bridge will understand that you do spend because it's a partnership game, you spend quite a lot of your time saying sorry partner whenever you do something stupid. So I've done a bridge podcast with them, and there's another sort of YouTube thing that I'm going to do with another sort of bridge organization. I was extremely lucky that a journalist picked up the sort of story of bridge and this book, and did an article on me in the Sunday Times, which was just wonderful. I mean, debut novelists do not get articles in the Sunday Times news section. So there was a very nice picture of me in there. I mean, at first I didn't take it seriously that it was going to happen. Somebody contacted me on Twitter and said, would you be interested in an interview? And of course I replied saying, yes, how wonderful. But only when the Sunday Times wrote to me and said, can we send a photographer tomorrow? I sort of thought, oh, okay. Well, if they want to do that, then I assume they actually want to do this. And sure enough, a photographer came, took billions of photographs, and then 2 days later it was in the Times. And I was like, okay, must have been a slow week for them to want to write something about bridge in here. But so that was wonderful. And then I have various bridge player friends of mine who run bridge columns in newspapers, have all promised to give it a plug. And a friend of mine who does the bridge column in The Spectator very kindly put me in there last week. So I think for a new novelist, a new writer, I think I've been really blessed with the amount of coverage I've got, really. I couldn't have asked for more.
Are you going to go to any book festivals or anything?
Yes, I'm going to the Chiswick Book Festival. I managed to somehow get on their list as a local author, even though I don't live in Chiswick anymore, but I did grow up there. So they very kindly invited me to do some sort of, it's like a tiny thing. I think you do 2 minutes on the stage somewhere called the Tabard, and I think that happens at the beginning of September. But anybody who wants me on a panel anywhere, I mean, I'm there. One of the things I really said to myself in all of this is I feel incredibly lucky that in my mid-50s I'm doing something new, and therefore whether it succeeds or doesn't succeed, I'm still just going to grab it with both hands and enjoy the journey. So I think if anybody wants me on any sort of literary festival, I'll be like, just give me 5 minutes to pack a bag. I'm there. You know, you've got a cancellation. I'm there, because, you know, you live once, don't you? And you just, I think you should grab it with both hands, basically.
Yeah, they're good to go to. Literature festivals are just good places to mingle with other authors.
Exactly. I went to the Crime Writers Association Christmas party last year, and I sort of thought, oh, should I take my husband? And then I thought, no, I'm not going to do that, because if I take my husband, I'm just going to stand in the corner and I won't speak to anybody. So I thought I'm going to go alone, because that's the only way that I will actually talk to other authors. So I did exactly that. And I must say we had a lot of fun. Lots of wine was consumed and lots of conversations were had. And it was a very fun evening.
Yeah, it's definitely fun. I advise going out and just meeting people is good. Well, I mean, other books, you know you're going to like them.
I think I'm very happy being sociable, and I'm very happy being not sociable, if that makes sense. I mean, as a writer, I think you have to like solitary confinement, because otherwise no words will appear unless you simply, you know, sit at your computer or however you do it, or with a notepad and twiddle your thumbs for about 4 hours, and then eventually you might write something. But I'm also a very sociable person. I think a lot of bridge players are very sociable. I mean, bridge tournaments are always crazy places where there is loads of partying that goes on, sometimes all night. So I like a bit of both. And I think going to literary festivals and meeting other writers sounds like a fantastic idea.
Yeah. You've got a minute left. Show off the book. Remind people what they're going to go and buy.
Did you say show off the book?
Yeah.
It's going to be backwards, I guess. But what you can see on here, you can see Scylla. And one of the things I really like about her is the back of her. She looks completely innocuous there, standing there. But then when you look at her shadow, you see that she's actually holding a crossbow. So presumably to commit some dastardly deed that she's going to do. Can I say thank you so much for having me on here tonight? It has been such good fun. And thank you to everybody who is taken part in this as well.
You're more than welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure. And when you've written book 2, whatever it is, welcome back anytime.
I would absolutely love to. Thank you for your time. It's been brilliant.